Charles Lazarus died on the 22nd of March 2018 at Mount Sinai Hospital in New York City. He was 94 years old. Respiratory failure. The liquidation sales began the next morning. The 23rd of March 2018, every remaining Toys R Us location in the United States opened its doors for the last time, not to sell toys, but to sell everything. The shelves, the fixtures, the shopping carts, the Jeffrey clocks, the turnstiles that had welcomed 3 generations of American children into a building that contained, as far as any child could tell, every toy ever manufactured. The founder did not live to see the final sales. Whether he knew, in the hospital, what was happening to the company he had built, whether someone told him, whether the news reached him through the fog of respiratory failure at 94 is not recorded. What is recorded is the timing. One day apart, the man who started it and the thing he started ended within 24 hours of each other. Toys R Us operated 1,600 stores in 38 countries. It employed 64,000 people. It sold 1 out of every 5 toys purchased in the United States. Annual revenue exceeded $11 billion. The jingle, "I don't want to grow up, I'm a Toys R Us kid," tested at 97% recognition among American children in the late 1980s, higher than the national anthem. In September 2017, with all of that still intact, the stores, the revenue, the market share, the cultural dominance, Toys R Us filed for bankruptcy. 6 months later, it liquidated. The company was not failing. Revenue was $11 billion. Operating profit was positive. The toy industry was growing. Children still wanted toys. Parents still wanted to buy them. The stores still drew families. What killed Toys R Us was not Amazon, not Walmart, not changing consumer behavior, not the decline of physical retail. What killed Toys R Us was $5.3 billion in debt that 3 private equity firms loaded onto the company for the purpose of buying it. Debt that consumed every dollar that should have gone into stores, technology, employees, and the future. Debt that turned a profitable company into one that could not afford to survive. The CEO collected a $2.8 million bonus 3 days before the bankruptcy filing. The 33,000 employees who lost their jobs received, through a later settlement, approximately $34 each. This is the story of Charles Lazarus, who came home from the war and built a toy store in his father's bicycle shop. And of the financial engineers who bought it, drained it, and left it to die. Charles Lazarus was born on the 4th of October, 1923, in Washington, D.C. His parents, Frank and Fanny, owned a bicycle repair shop. He grew up above the shop, in a neighborhood where commerce was not an abstraction. It was the sound of his father's tools, the smell of rubber and chain oil, the transactions happening 10 feet below his bedroom. During World War II, Lazarus served as a cryptologist in the U.S. Army, a codebreaker, deciphering intercepted communications, looking for patterns in data that other people missed. It was, in retrospect, the perfect training for retail. Retail is pattern recognition. What do people buy? When do they buy it? Why do they come back? He came home in 1948 with a hunch, not a business plan, a hunch. Everyone he had served with was getting married, starting families, having children. The baby boom had begun, but the term didn't exist yet. Lazarus didn't need the term. He could see it in every neighborhood, every church, every hospital waiting room. America was about to be overrun with babies, and babies needed things. He opened a small store in his father's old bicycle shop. Children's bargain town, baby furniture, cribs, carriages, strollers, high chairs. Initial capital, $5,000 savings, plus a small bank loan. Within a year, he noticed something that would shape the next 6 decades of his life. Customers bought a crib once. They bought a high chair once. They bought a stroller once. These were single purchase items. The customer came, bought what they needed, and didn't return until their second child needed a different size. But toys were different. Customers who came in for a crib would browse the small toy section he'd added, almost as an afterthought. A few rattles, some stuffed animals, and buy something. Then they'd come back a month later, and buy another toy. Then another. Then another. The toy purchases were repeating. The furniture purchases were not. The cryptologist recognized the pattern. The furniture was the acquisition. The toys were the retention. By 1957, Lazarus had made the pivot that would define his legacy. He abandoned furniture entirely and opened the first store dedicated exclusively to toys. He named it Toys R Us. The backwards R was his idea, designed to look like a child's handwriting, a detail so small and so precise that it became one of the most recognized logos in American retail. The store in Rockville, Maryland, was not like other toy shops. Other toy shops were small. They carried limited inventory. They displayed products behind glass. They were staffed by adults who selected what children should want. Lazarus built a supermarket for toys, warehouse-scale floor space, concrete floors, not carpet, cheaper to maintain, easier to clean, shelves stacked high. Thousands of products visible simultaneously. Discount pricing, year-round operation, not seasonal. The child walked in and was confronted with everything at once. The abundance was the experience. The format was a category killer, a retail concept so dominant in its niche that it drove out every competitor. Small toy shops could not match the selection. Department stores could not match the prices. Nobody could match the experience of walking into a building that contained, as far as a child could tell, every toy that had ever been manufactured. By the 1970s, the chain was growing rapidly. Geoffrey the giraffe appeared as the store mascot in 1973. The Jingle debuted in the early 1980s and lodged itself in the national consciousness with a permanence that few advertising campaigns have ever achieved. I don't want to grow up. I'm a Toys R Us kid. There's a million toys at Toys R Us that I can play with. The company went public in 1978. By 1983, it had expanded internationally. By the late 1980s, Toys R Us was the undisputed king of the toy industry. More than 25% market share in the United States. Stores in Canada, Europe, Asia, Australia. In 1992, President George H.W. Bush personally attended the opening of the first Toys R Us in Japan, a diplomatic event. A toy store opening was treated as international trade policy. Charles Lazarus stepped down as CEO in 1994 and as chairman in 1998. In that same year, 1998, Walmart surpassed Toys R Us as the largest toy retailer in the United States for the first time. The empire was still vast. The cracks were beginning. But the thing that would ultimately destroy Toys R Us was not a competitor. It was a financial instrument. On the 17th of March, 2005, Bain Capital Partners, Kohlberg Kravis Roberts, and Vornado Realty Trust announced the acquisition of Toys R Us for $6.6 billion. This was a leveraged buyout. The term sounds technical. The mechanics are simple. In a leveraged buyout, the acquiring firms do not use their own money to purchase the company. They use the company's money. Specifically, they take out loans against the company's assets and future revenue. The company itself becomes collateral for its own acquisition. The buyers put up a small fraction of the purchase price, their equity, and borrow the rest. The borrowed money becomes the company's debt. In the Toys R Us deal, the private equity consortium invested approximately $1.3 billion of their own capital. The remaining $5.3 billion was debt that was loaded onto Toys R Us's balance sheet. The company that had been acquired was now responsible for paying back the money that had been used to acquire it. This meant that Toys R Us, a company that had been operating with manageable debt and steady cash flow, was suddenly carrying $5.3 billion in obligations. The annual interest payments alone were between $400 and $500 million every year. Before investing $1 in stores, employees, technology, marketing, or inventory, Toys R Us owed roughly $500 million to its creditors. The private equity firms, meanwhile, began collecting fees, management advisory fees, transaction fees, monitoring fees. The precise amounts varied by year and are documented in the bankruptcy filings, but the cumulative total was in the hundreds of millions of dollars. These fees were paid regardless of the company's performance. Whether Toys R Us thrived or collapsed, The private equity owners collected their money. This is the structural mechanism that killed the company. Not mismanagement, not a failure of strategy, not disruption by Amazon or competition from Walmart. The debt, specifically, the debt that was loaded onto the company by its owners for the purpose of buying it. The math is not complicated. Toys R Us generated approximately $11 billion in annual revenue in the years before its bankruptcy. The company was profitable at an operating level. Internal financial documents, later revealed in bankruptcy proceedings, showed that the company had the operational revenue to compete to renovate stores, build an e-commerce platform, invest in the customer experience that had once made it the most exciting retail destination in America. It could not spend that revenue on any of those things, because the revenue was already spoken for. Interest payments, principal payments, advisory fees, transaction costs. The financial obligations of the leveraged buyout consumed the capital that should have been invested in the business. Stores that needed renovation went unrenovated. The aisles that had once felt magical began to feel tired. Shelves that had been stacked with exciting new products were filled with excess inventory that couldn't move. The website, which should have been Toys R Us's most important investment as e-commerce grew, remained clunky, slow, and years behind competitors. In 2000, before the leveraged buyout, Toys R Us had actually tried to build an online presence. They signed a 10-year deal with Amazon to be the exclusive toy seller on Amazon's platform. The partnership collapsed in litigation by 2004. Toys R Us sued Amazon for allowing other toy sellers onto the platform, violating the exclusivity agreement. The lawsuit was settled, but Toys R Us emerged from it without an e-commerce partner and without a functional website of its own. A company with $5.3 billion in debt did not have the capital to build one from scratch. This is the part of the story where the standard narrative breaks down. The standard narrative says Amazon killed Toys R Us, that e-commerce made physical toy stores obsolete, that children stopped wanting to go to stores. None of this is true. Amazon sold toys at a loss. Walmart sold toys at a loss. They used toys as traffic drivers, put the hot holiday toy at a price nobody could match, get the family through the door or onto the site, and sell them everything else at a margin. This is called a loss leader. It works when you sell groceries and electronics and clothing and household goods alongside toys. It does not work when you only sell toys. Toys R Us could not compete on price with companies that were willing to lose money on every toy they sold. But Toys R Us was never supposed to compete on price. It was supposed to compete on experience. The warehouse-scale store, the abundance, the turnstile, the Saturday afternoon pilgrimage that was the competitive advantage that no website could replicate. Maintaining that experience required investment. Renovating stores, training staff, updating displays, building a functional website for the customers who did want to browse online. All of it required capital, and the capital was gone. $400 to $500 million a year gone to interest payments before a single shelf was restocked. Amazon, meanwhile, had no such constraint. Walmart had no such constraint. Target had no such constraint. Every competitor that Toys R Us faced in the 2010s was free to invest in its own future. Toys R Us was not. The cage was built from its own acquisition. The private equity model is sometimes described as a partnership between investors and the companies they acquire. The investors provide capital and expertise. The company provides operations and revenue. Together, they build value. The Toys R Us acquisition did not follow this model. What followed was closer to what labor advocates and financial analysts have described as extraction, the systematic removal of value from a company by its owners, regardless of the impact on the company's ability to operate. The advisory fees were the most visible form of extraction. Bain, KKR, and Vornado charged Toys R Us millions annually for advisory services, strategic guidance, management consulting, financial oversight. The company was simultaneously paying millions to external consulting firms like McKinsey for the same services. The private equity owners were being paid for advice, while the company was also paying other people for advice. Two advisory streams, one company footing both bills. The perverse incentive structure was documented in post-bankruptcy analysis. Every time Toys R Us restructured its debt, every time it tried to renegotiate terms, extend maturities, or reduce interest rates, the transaction generated fees, legal fees, banking fees, advisory fees. The private equity firms and their affiliated service providers earned money from every financial maneuver the company made. The worse the financial situation became, the more restructuring was required, and the more fees were generated. The employees paid a different kind of price. As the debt consumed available capital, Toys R Us reduced investment in the workforce. Store staffing levels were cut, training programs were reduced. The employees who remained were expected to do more with less, in stores that were deteriorating, with technology that was falling behind, serving customers who could increasingly buy the same products cheaper and faster online. The store experienced the thing that had made Toys R Us special, the thing that no online retailer could replicate, degraded year by year. The aisles that had once felt magical felt cluttered and neglected. The lighting that had once felt exciting felt harsh and institutional. The displays that had once invited children to touch and explore felt tired and outdated. The stores looked like what they were, a business that couldn't afford to take care of itself. Former executives testified in bankruptcy proceedings that they had the plans, the ideas, and the operational knowledge to compete. What they lacked was the capital. Every dollar that could have gone into renovating a store or improving a website or training an employee went instead to servicing the debt that the private equity firms had imposed. The bankruptcy filing was dated the 18th of September 2017. Toys R Us listed $5.2 billion in debt against $6.6 billion in assets. The timing was deliberate after the back-to-school season, but before the critical Christmas period. The hope was that Chapter 11 protection would provide breathing room to restructure, close underperforming stores, and emerge as a smaller but viable company. The hope was misplaced. The filing itself triggered a cascade that accelerated the collapse. Suppliers, the toy manufacturers who shipped products to Toys R Us stores, read the bankruptcy announcement and immediately began demanding cash on delivery. They had seen this pattern before. Circuit City. Blockbuster. A bankruptcy filing followed by deteriorating conditions, followed by liquidation, followed by unpaid invoices. The suppliers wanted their money up front. Toys R Us's holiday season depended on having full shelves. Full shelves required credit from suppliers. The credit was gone. The shelves began to empty. The 2017 holiday season was disappointing. Not catastrophic. People still came, still bought toys, but below the projections that the bankruptcy restructuring plan required. The covenants tied to the company's emergency financing included revenue targets. Toys R Us missed them. In March 2018, the company announced it would liquidate, not restructure, not emerge from bankruptcy as a smaller chain. Liquidate, close every store, sell every product, lay off every employee. 33,000 people lost their jobs. The liquidation process revealed details that made the financial arrangement look less like a business deal and more like a crime scene. The company's bankruptcy lawyers, the firm of Kirkland & Ellis, were awarded approximately $56 million in fees for representing Toys R Us during the proceedings. The workers who lost their jobs were initially told they would receive no severance at all. After public outcry and pressure from labor groups, a severance fund was established. The total payout for all 33,000 workers was roughly $20 million, $2 million from the bankruptcy estate, and an additional $20 million hardship fund, contributed by the private equity owners. The math on the severance is devastating. Part-time workers received approximately $34 each. Full-time workers received approximately $60. Workers who had spent 20 years building the company that Charles Lazarus founded received less than the cost of a family dinner. The CEO, David Brandon, had ordered his own retention bonus, $2.8 million, to be paid 3 days before the bankruptcy filing. He did this after being informed by company lawyers that the bonus would likely not be approved by the bankruptcy court if paid after the filing. So he paid it to himself before the filing, 3 days before. Before the liquidation, before the debt, before the private equity firms and the advisory fees and the $34 severance checks, before any of it, there was the store. And the store was something. The buildings were warehouse scale, set back from the road behind enormous parking lots. Blue and white signage with the backwards R, the letter reversed, to look like a child had written it visible from a quarter-mile away. Geoffrey the giraffe painted on the front wall, a turnstile at the entrance that clicked as you pushed through it, separating the parking lot from the inside, the ordinary world from something else. Inside was controlled chaos, aisles stacked floor to ceiling with boxes, not behind glass, not in display cases, on shelves, within reach, touchable. The Lego aisle, the Barbie aisle, the action figure aisle where Star Wars and G.I. Joe and Transformers competed for shelf space in a permanent arms race of plastic and imagination, the bike section in the back, the video game wall near the front, the baby section on the far side with its own entrance that would eventually become Babies R Us. The sensory experience was specific: cardboard and new plastic, fluorescent lights buzzing slightly, the squeak of a shopping cart wheel that was always slightly off-center, the sound of a child running and a parent calling after them. The particular vertigo of standing in an aisle where every direction held something you wanted and couldn't have. For 3 decades, Toys R Us was not a store. It was a pilgrimage. Birthdays, Christmas, report card rewards. The place where a child learned what it felt like to want everything at once and to choose only one thing. The place where parents watched their children's faces change as they walked through the turnstile and realized what was on the other side. No algorithm replicates this. No website. No delivery box left on a porch. The physical experience of standing inside a building that was designed from the concrete floor to the fluorescent ceiling to make a child feel like the most important person in the world, that was the product. Not the toys. The experience of choosing them. The private equity firms that acquired Toys R Us in 2005 did not understand this, or understood it and did not care. The debt they loaded onto the company consumed the capital that should have maintained the experience. Year by year, the stores deteriorated. The aisles that had once felt magical felt cluttered and neglected. The displays that had once invited exploration felt tired. The lighting that had once felt exciting felt institutional. The experience degraded, and with it, the reason to come. Not suddenly. The way a house deteriorates when the owner stops spending on maintenance, one deferred repair at a time, until the whole structure fails and everyone acts surprised. But the failure was years in the making. Toys R Us didn't lose its customers to Amazon. It lost them to its own owners, the firms that starved the thing that made people come and then blamed the people for not coming. The closing sales began immediately. Store, closing. Everything must go, up to 70% off. The signs went up in every window across America. Customers came back, not because they cared about the company, because the televisions were discounted and the board games were half price, and the Lego sets that had been $30 were now $12. They came for the deals. They scavenged. The employees worked the liquidation sales in their Toys R Us uniforms, answering questions from customers who asked things like, "Where are you going to work after this?" And, "Is everything really closing?" And, "My kids are going to be so sad." The employees, who had just learned they would receive no severance or, later, $34 processed transactions and stacked shelves and cleaned floors in a building that was being sold around them. One employee at a shuttering Babies R Us in New Hampshire emailed CEO David Brandon directly. She had been promised severance. Then, roughly a week later, she was told the promise was rescinded. Brandon responded. His reply, later included in court filings, read in part, "While there is nothing I can do or say to make you feel any better about the very painful situation we are living through," he had collected $2.8 million 3 days before the filing. There was, in fact, something he could have done. The fixtures were for sale, the shelving units, the checkout counters, the display racks. Everything that could be removed and sold was removed and sold. What remained was an empty building, concrete floors, bare walls, disconnected wiring that would eventually be leased to a mattress store or a Spirit Halloween or a Burlington coat factory. The Jeffrey clock that had hung above the front entrance of every Toys R Us for decades, the giraffe's arms, serving as the hour and minute hands, was removed and sold or thrown away. The disposition of the Jeffrey clocks is not comprehensively documented. What is documented is the community response. In hundreds of towns across America, the closing of the local Toys R Us was a local event, local news coverage, parents bringing children for one last visit, people standing in the parking lot taking photographs of the sign before it was taken down, the particular grief of watching a building that holds your childhood memories being emptied and repurposed. By June 2018, the liquidation was complete. All US stores were closed. The brand was sold. The intellectual property, the name, the logo, the backwards R, Jeffrey the Giraffe, was acquired by an investment group called True Kids Inc. Various attempts to revive the brand followed. Small format stores inside other retailers, pop-up locations. An AI-generated advertisement in 2024 that depicted a young Charles Lazarus dreaming of Jeffrey in a surreal toy store, produced using OpenAI's Sora tool. The ad was widely criticized for its uncanny valley visuals and its use of AI to animate the likeness of a dead founder. The physical stores, the buildings that Lazarus had designed to be enormous, overwhelming, full of everything, are gone. In their place, mattress stores, discount retailers, warehouse gyms. The buildings retain their distinctive shape, the flat roof, the large footprint, the setback parking lot, and anyone who grew up visiting Toys R Us can identify a former location by its architecture alone. The building remembers, even when the sign does not. The private equity firms that acquired Toys R Us invested approximately $1.3 billion of their own equity. They collected hundreds of millions in advisory and transaction fees over the 13 years they owned the company. When Toys R Us liquidated, the firms lost most of their equity investment, but the fees they had already collected significantly offset that loss. The suppliers lost $800 million in unpaid invoices. The employees lost their jobs, 33,000 of them. Most received $34 to $60 in severance. The bankruptcy lawyers received $56 million. The CEO received $2.8 million 3 days before the filing. Charles Lazarus received a funeral. The toy industry did not decline. In 2017, the year Toys R Us filed for bankruptcy, global toy industry revenue was growing. The company was still selling 1/5 of all toys in the United States. Revenue was $11 billion. The stores were generating operating profit. The business was not failing. The financial structure was failing. This distinction matters because the standard narrative that Amazon killed Toys R Us, that e-commerce disrupted physical toy retail, that children stopped wanting to go to stores, is not supported by the evidence. The evidence, contained in bankruptcy filings and court testimony and financial disclosures, tells a different story. A story about a company that was profitable, that had the revenue to compete, and that was prevented from competing by a debt structure imposed by the people who owned it. 40% of retail bankruptcies between 2015 and 2017 were private equity-owned chains. Payless Shoe Source, Gymboree, Wet Seal, Rue 21, Claire's, Radio Shack. The pattern repeats. A leveraged buyout loads debt. Fees are extracted. Investment is deferred. The company deteriorates. The company files for bankruptcy. The employees lose their jobs. The private equity firms lose some equity, but keep their fees. The community loses its store. The Jingle promised something specific. It promised that growing up was optional, that there would always be a place where the rules of adulthood did not apply, where a child could walk through a turnstile and enter a world organized entirely around the experience of being young and wanting things. The promise was not kept, but the failure to keep it was not Toys R Us's failure. The stores worked, the format worked, the experience worked. Children still wanted to go, parents still wanted to take them. The Jingle still played in the heads of 30-year-olds, who heard it once in 1989 and could not forget it. The demand was there, the product was there, the cultural connection was there. What was not there was the capital to maintain it, because the capital had been extracted, loaded onto a balance sheet as debt, drawn off as fees, allocated to interest payments, consumed by the financial machinery of a leveraged buyout that was never designed to make Toys R Us better. It was designed to make money for the firms that acquired it, and it did, until there was no more money to make. And then the firms walked away and the stores closed and the employees got $34 and Jeffrey the giraffe went into a warehouse somewhere. It is the same pattern. A company builds something that millions of people love. The trust becomes so embedded in daily life that it feels permanent. And then the people who control the company, executives, investors, board members, financial engineers, make decisions that prioritize their own returns over the thing they were trusted to protect. Kodak buried a technology to protect its margins. Blockbuster charged late fees to protect its revenue. Circuit City fired its best employees to protect its labor costs. And Toys R Us was loaded with debt to protect the returns of 3 private equity firms that had no intention of running a toy store for the next 50 years. The mechanism is different each time. The result is the same. The trust is broken. The people who depended on it, the employees, the customers, the communities, are left with nothing. Or $34. The backwards R was a small decision. Charles Lazarus designed it to look like a child's handwriting, the letter reversed, imperfect, endearing. It was a branding choice that communicated, without words, that this store was built for children. That the people who ran it understood what it was like to do small and to want things, that the name itself had been written by the people it was meant for. The backwards R outlived the company. It exists now as intellectual property, owned by an investment group, licensed for use on products and pop-up stores and AI-generated advertisements. The symbol persists. What it represented does not. Charles Lazarus was a cryptologist. He spent the war looking for patterns in data, finding meaning in signals that other people could not read. When he came home, he applied the same skill to retail. He watched what people bought. He listened to what they asked for. He noticed that cribs were bought once and toys were bought forever. He built a company on that observation. A simple observation made by a man standing in a small store, watching his customers. No financial engineering, no leveraged buyout, no advisory fees, just a man who paid attention to what people needed and built something to serve them. The private equity firms that bought his company paid $6.6 billion for it. They did not pay attention to what people needed. They paid attention to what they could extract. And when the extraction was complete, they moved on. The stores are gone. The sign is gone. The backwards R, that small imperfect letter designed to look like a child wrote it, is a trademark in a portfolio. And the jingle, "I don't want to grow up, I'm a Toys R Us kid," still plays in the heads of millions of Americans who remember what it felt like to walk through that turnstile and see everything at once. The turnstile is gone too, but the feeling it created, the particular vertigo of abundance, the electric joy of being a child in a building full of toys that persists, not in a store, in a memory. A memory that the people who destroyed Toys R Us cannot reach, cannot monetize, cannot load with debt, and cannot liquidate. That belongs to the people who were there, and it is worth considerably more than $34.